has been in recent years seem to be very like America. That is, we've been repeatedly told that we're a divided society and divided along specific political lines. Now, in the UK, those lines were pro or anti-Brexit. And of course, that pretty much was solved at the end of January this year when Britain left the European Union finally. So we've got a fairly united front in this particular crisis at the moment, in a way that I think America doesn't, because in America, not least obviously because you've got an election coming up, this crisis seems to me to be being seen inevitably through the prism of what do you think about Donald Trump and do you want him re-elected? So mercifully, we haven't had quite that sort of clear divide that you've got going on there between people who'd like to use the coronavirus to get Donald Trump out of the White House and those who'd like to use it to keep him in. But there are certainly the beginnings of a type of line emerging, a competition emerging, shall we say, which is the same one that we're going to have everywhere, which is the very significant tension that is emerging between the people saying we have to keep people, particularly the elderly who are most vulnerable to the virus, safe, and those saying we just can't go on with this forever. The British government is currently borrowing at levels that are higher than at any time since the Second World War. And some of us, myself included, think that this is very unwise for a range of reasons, one of which is the point of running up the debt after the Second World War was because this was something that was never going to be needed again, something that would never happen again, we hoped. I don't think anyone can say that with this virus. I think we are mounting up unbelievable levels of debt and doing so to tackle something which is quite likely to happen again, certainly in our lifetimes.
When you look at, again, that political debate, one of the things that I wonder is whether that exposes not so much the difference between left and right transnationally as the difference between perhaps the American right and the British right, meaning that the European right has been for a very long time a lot more friendly to the idea of a massive social safety net. Even the Conservative Party in Britain isn't talking about dismantling the National Health Service. In the United States, obviously, the Republican Party has been very much against the federal government getting deeply involved in the economy, providing the sorts of financial guarantees that European governments do fairly regularly. Does that really expose the difference between sort of the differences between European right and American right?
Yeah, I think that is true. The British and European right long ago made their peace with the welfare state in a way which I think isn't the case, obviously, in the US to the same extent. The Conservative Party at the moment, I mean, it's in a very interesting position. It has become the party of the National Health Service. Now, the Labour Party, the left-wing party here in the UK, has tried for years to win elections by saying every time, you've only got X number of days left to save the NHS. You know, if you vote Conservative, they will dismantle, privatize, whatever, the NHS. I've heard that all my life. We've got 3 days to save the NHS, 2 years, 1 day, 2 hours. That's what they always say. And here we see this incredible moment where the Conservative Party has not only been more than adequately funding the NHS, but cannot possibly be accused of being anti the National Health Service at the moment. Every minister turns up the press conferences with an NHS badge on their lapel. I mean, they've got it written on them. And so I think that critique of the left is going to be hard to sustain. It has an obvious downfall, doesn't it? Which is when the Conservative Party simply has to keep doing anything that the NHS asks for, satisfy every demand, because it's become so much in hock to it. Now, I mean, there are problems here because the NHS does some things well and does some things badly. It's a service, not a deity. But under this government and in this crisis, inevitably, it's become a sort of deity, and that's going to have problems down the road.
So in your book, The Strange Death of Europe, you talk about all of these sort of fragmenting elements that have been happening in Europe for years. And it feels like the pandemic has really exacerbated a lot of these problems. Obviously, there were serious debt problems in a lot of countries in Europe before this. The idea of sort of a unified economic bloc didn't make a lot of sense when Germany was footing the bill for Greece. And when it comes to immigration, obviously, there were serious underlying problems with the idea that every country was going to have completely permeable borders. There's been this sort of talk in the United States that everybody's a socialist during a pandemic, but what it really seems like is everybody's a nationalist during a pandemic.
Oh, yeah, well, it's both of those things, isn't it? I mean, it seems so to me. I mean, everyone's in favor of massive spending and of shutting all the borders. I mean, I covered the migration crisis of 2015, firsthand. I traveled very widely across the continent and the continents people were coming from. And, in 2015, when hundreds of thousands of people were pouring into Europe illegally, I used to think, why isn't this able to be stopped? And people would tell me, you've got to understand, we live in a globalized world, and it's not possible to shut borders. This is simply the modern world. I remember one of the former French ministers saying to me, there's nothing that can be done. And so you can imagine that it's with a certain amount of, glee, I suppose, that I noticed people like Justin Trudeau shutting all the borders of Canada, having told us for years that, the open borders were just a thing that we all lived with and there were only upsides. And then the coronavirus comes along and it turns out even Justin Trudeau can shut the borders at a moment's notice. This happened across Europe. It's something that we were told wasn't possible with the immigration crisis, was certainly possible with the corona crisis. But there are lots of tensions in Europe that this has opened up. The most interesting, to my mind, is the North-South divide, which always goes on. One of the obviously, we in Britain have now left the European Union. It always seems to me slightly rude to criticize a club you've just resigned from. But some of us who were always critics of the EU used to say that the fundamental problem, particularly of monetary union, was the idea that you could meld German and Italian fiscal habits, or Greek and German bookkeeping. And, one of the fascinating tensions has just broken out again over this coronavirus, which is this North-South divide, where the South, once again, is absolutely at the brunt of the problem. I mean, it's Italy and Spain that first had the worst mortality figures in this virus. And having been lectured for years, as those countries were, by the North, telling them that there needed to be greater integration and a greater pooling of sovereignty, what happens when the coronavirus hits? But both France and Germany suddenly become completely protectionist over the export of masks, oxygen, and other necessities. And you can imagine, the southern European countries, particularly Italy, looks at this, has been told for years that this is precisely the sort of the thing that the EU has been set up to avoid. And the two countries that lectured them hardest, France and Germany, turn out, when needed, to be just as nationalistic as the countries they had been attacking all of these years. Particularly Monsieur Macron and Chancellor Merkel have loved attacking people for being nationalists in Central and Eastern Europe, love attacking people for being protectionists in these countries. But it turns out that there is something which makes them do exactly the same and actually a lot more.
We will make America great again.